This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and this is episode 958 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by Underdog. Thanks for tuning in. Before getting to the trends this week, I want to just remind you that even though you drafted your fantasy teams all the way back in August, you can still do snake drafts right now over on Underdog. Just head to UnderdogFantasy.com or download the Underdog app. In the draft sections, click NFL. You'll see tons of drafts that you can participate in right now. And if you're new to Underdog, make sure you sign up with promo code LATEROUND. That'll get you a nice deposit bonus, as well as my rest of season rankings if you're still needing those. That's UnderdogFantasy.com. You can also download the app, promo code LATEROUND. The first trend this week is about Tyrone Tracy. He saw a nice uptick in usage in Week 14. Tracy played 83% of New York's offensive snaps, which was just the second time this year that he's been above the 80% mark. He ran a route on 71% of the Giants' dropbacks. That was a season high. His 21.7% target share, a season high. And his 89% running back rush share was the second highest of his season. The Giants are a dumpster fire, but they're at least feeding Tyrone Tracy. With Derek Carr's health up in the air, I figured this next trend might be useful. Carr missed weeks 6, 7, and 8 earlier this year. Alvin Kamara averaged 14.7 PPR points per game in those three contests. And that includes his only PPR performance this year with fewer than 10 points. That average is lower than his season-long average outside of those games, which is over 20. The thing is, though, Kamara's already been trending in the wrong direction. He's averaging just 14.4 PPR points per game over his last four. And now Kendre Miller's back. And in Week 14, Kamara had a 57% running back rush share. That was his third lowest mark of the year. Basically, I think we all need to accept that Alvin Kamara is not going to likely perform like he did earlier this season down the stretch, which is unfortunate because it's the most important part of the fantasy season. The Eagles have been running the ball a lot. I've talked about it before on this 10 Trends episode, but it's really starting to hurt A.J. Brown. First, though, Jalen Hurts, he averaged 33 pass attempts from weeks 1 to 4. Since then, he's been at 21.4. He hasn't had 30 pass attempts in a game since that 4-week stretch ended. A.J. Brown, during his first 3 games this year, remember he did miss some time earlier this season, but during his first 3 games, he was averaging 22.1 PPR points per game. Since then, he's been at 12.7. It's pretty wild because I thought the Eagles might go in the other direction this year with Kellen Moore. Huge miss by me. But this is their identity, and it's ruined their pass catchers for fantasy purposes. David Njoku has been balling out. He has target shares of 30% and 35% over his last 2 games. He scored 26 and 17 PPR points in those contests. Since Amari Cooper left town, Njoku's averaged almost a 24% target share per game rate. And since Jameis Winston took over, Njoku's averaging over 15 PPR points per game. He's a full-blown higher-end tight end 1 right now. The Rams haven't had Puka Nacua and Cooper Kupp all season, as we know. Even still, as it stands today, their wide receiver target share is almost 77%, meaning 77% of their total targets have gone to wideouts. Going back to 2011, that's the highest of any team. It's higher than the 2015 Jets, who had Eric Decker and Brandon Marshall combined for over 300 targets. Sean McVay's offenses just don't target running backs at a very high rate. And the tight ends, they're not good enough to command high target shares. That's what creates a situation like this, and it's great for Puka Nacua and Cooper Kupp. The Arizona Cardinals defense has been low-key good against quarterbacks since the early parts of the season. It's not to say the Cardinals defense is awesome, but they've definitely limited quarterbacks. To start the year across their first 6 games, they allowed 3 top 5 performances. Josh Allen, Jaden Daniels, and Jordan Love, they all got there against Arizona. Since then, not a single quarterback has finished higher than QB 12. They're now, according to adjusted fantasy points allowed, they're a fringe bottom 5 matchup. Only one quarterback during this stretch has thrown more than 1 touchdown against them. It's pretty wild since I think a lot of people may not see it this way. But props to the Cardinals. Now, speaking of the Cardinals, James Conner, he's seen a nice little uptick in running back rush share over the last couple of weeks. He had 3 weeks where his share was just 53% per game, but over his last 2, he's been at 74% and 90%. That 90% running back rush share that he saw this past week, that was a top 4 number for him on the year. Arizona's got a pretty favorable playoff schedule for running backs, so he's trending to be a very, very valuable piece for fantasy teams. And make sure you've got Trey Benson. He'd take on a lot of work if James Conner were to get hurt, though I'm not convinced that he'd be a full-blown bell cow. Zach Moss went on IR in week 9. So we played 5 games, or the Bengals have played 5 games with Chase Brown as their lead back. Brown has ranked as a top 10 fantasy back in all 5 of those games. He's averaging a running back rush share per game rate of 96%. His target share per game is 15%. He scored over 22 PPR points per game. There's no reason to think that Chase Brown is not an elite running back from here on out. He's a league-winning player this year. Now, there's a pretty good chance that George Pickens is not back for the Steelers this week. If that's the case, unfortunately, it's going to be tough to trust any of the wide receivers there. It's a tough matchup, but even if it wasn't, they really split things up in week 14. Like, we were interested to see if Mike Williams would get more run without George Pickens. And what we saw was that no Pittsburgh Steelers wide receiver had higher than a 72% route participation rate. And it wasn't even Mike Williams. Now, Williams did see more work. He saw a 45% route share and a 20% target share. Those were both season highs for the Steelers. But that route share just isn't very strong. And it would be tough to bank on that from a forecasting standpoint in the fantasy playoffs, even if the Steelers do end up using Mike Williams more this week. So while I do think that's in the range of outcomes here, I think they could use Williams more, given the fact that he had an elite targets per route run rate last week. I still think it would be really tough to trust here in the fantasy playoffs, given how they used him against the Browns. Now, I've got one more trend for you this week. It's about DK Metcalf. Metcalf hasn't posted a wide receiver 2 performance or better in 4 straight games. He's averaging 10.9 PPR points per game during that time frame. For as well as JSN's playing, DK Metcalf, it's the complete opposite. And many are probably wondering why. Well, I can tell you that he unfortunately isn't really playing too far below expectation. According to PFF's expected fantasy points formula, during this 4-game stretch, his expected fantasy points is around 12.5 PPR points per game. Again, he's at 10.9. So yeah, he's playing below expectation, but not severely below expectation. The truth is, a lot of his peripherals look the exact same as they did to start the year. Before this stretch, he had a 23% target share. Now it's been 26%. He's actually had a better catchable target rate. He's seen slightly fewer end zone targets, and his average at the target, it's fallen by over a yard. Those are things that can impact his output, but not this dramatically. I mean, he went from averaging 15.1 PPR points per game to 10.9 over his last 4. I'd argue a lot of this comes down to 2 things, though. One is just straight up variance. While he was averaging a lot more points earlier this year, he also was playing above expectation back then. His expected points per game was about a point lower than his actual points per game. And now the opposite is kind of happening. But there's a 2-point gap between his expected points per game earlier this season to now. Some of that can be explained by the end zone targets in the ADOT, right? He's seeing fewer end zone targets, his average at the target not quite as high. But it's also that Seattle just isn't getting as many opportunities in the passing game. The Seahawks have played slower over their last 3 games. They've also had a pass rate over expected below 0, according to Fantasy Life data, in 4 of their last 6. During their first 7 games of the year, which is when DK Metcalf was playing in his good split, the Seahawks had a below average pass rate over expected just once. They were throwing the ball a lot. You see, Metcalf has this 26% target share over his last 4 games. That's higher than his target share during his first 7. But he's performing worse. But in those first 7, he averaged 8.7 targets per game. Recently, that number's 7.3. So all of these small things, along with the lack of touchdowns, they're adding up. I think he might be a little bit banged up, sure. But this is a classic case where the situation has changed and it looks a lot worse because of some statistical variance. Now, I don't know if we're going to see him perform like he did to start the year, but I don't think that DK Metcalf is just fully broken right now. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you get subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter and Blue Sky at Late Round QB. Thanks for listening, everyone. I'll talk to you tomorrow with the Weekly Sleeper Show.